Considering the history of Captiva's writers, poets, artists, and tradesmen, here tonight we highlight only a significant 4 with criteria including international merit, but also observing the artist's relationship with the island herself. A conversation between man and his environment are dependent upon one another. This is essential for the survival of both the island and her artist.
He was credited for starting that refuge, but you know, that's a big claim to be the guy really responsible for it. Well, it turns out to be absolutely true. He was.
J. Norwood Darling was born October 21st, 1876. For a half-century, Darling influenced the thoughts of millions of Americans with his cartoons, for which he twice was awarded the Pulitzer Prize.
It was about 25 years ago that I picked myself a nice little hideout on an island about 15 miles from the nearest dock on the mainland of the west coast of Florida.
You know, people walk in this room, and about the first question they ask when they see the room is that real? And yes, it is real. It's called a punt gun. It was highly illegal. They caught a group one night, and then they gave it to my grandfather. Virtually all of the pioneer conservationists in the country were hunters. They were the nucleus of the conservation movement. Birds were going extinct. I mean, truly extinct. Gone. Darling one time said, they're the delicate indicator for the future of mankind. They go extinct, we're not far behind.
By any measure, J. Norwood Darling was one of the best cartoonists in the United States. He was also one of the most durable. He began his cartooning career in 1900 and retired from it nearly 50 years later. Darling witnessed staggering changes in the world around him.
Darling recognized the estuary, and it's absolutely critical for the next generation of fish and the next generation of birds. When he learned that developers were about to buy the property, which later became the refuge, from the state. The price, I don't know if I mentioned, but the price was 25 cents an acre. He put together an outfit called the Captiva Island. Actually, in those days, the real civilization was at the end of the road at Captiva. And of course, Darling had a tremendous amount of clout in those days. It took an awful lot of work, and an awful lot of that work was done by people on Sanibel and Captiva.
I was completely surrounded by wilderness. Gulf of Mexico waters on one side, smooth bay waters on the other, and both of them full of fish. Catamounts, bobcats, quail, and flocks of ibis, and no possible way that unwelcome strangers could find their way to my front door.
Ding Darling bought it from Mr. Chadwick, who was the main landowner. He planted this wonderful citrus grove, and he did all the engineering of the water from the artesian well.
And this door was always open, but in here was a cistern, and the people from the fish house got their drinking water from it, as did we living in Ding's house right here.
It was the best water on the island. There was no other water to compare with it until the golf course was built at South Seas, and then suddenly it dried up.
He was, for instance, the first artist who truly succeeded in picturing birds in flight. Even really fine artists had been struggling with that. You'll notice that there are many different wing positions, and that gives the impression of motion.
Ding Darling got to the point where he needed to leave the island. He sold to my father. The original house was a shoebox, and I would say that the original living room was probably 18 feet wide. And then over here, should we go in the bedroom? Amazing. It's the same. And Ding Darling had this spring house and a little pool. It was an incessant spring.
He had a series of troughs descending across the orchard, that he could control the salinity in. He made a serious attempt over more than 1 year to acclimate saltwater fish to freshwater.
This is the room I used to stay in. We kept the little canoe right down here. This grass was all planted by Ding Darling, and it was saltwater proof. We never walked across it except when we were out to pluck a grapefruit for breakfast. He built the fish house, I think, to have a studio. That was given to Penny Darling as a birthday present. And Penny Darling was a bridge player. She loved to play cards at Tween Waters Inn.
Now, bear in mind, this was a gal that grew up in the prairie on the frontier. She could handle tough. You know, Tween Waters was a very comfortable place. The meals were all provided. And they better be, because there were no other place to eat on the island in those days.
Founded in 1931 by Grace and Bowman Price, Tween Waters Inn remains under responsible and educated supervision to ensure the inn's remarkable history and island tradition.
Here we are, starting at the Ding Darling Cottage. This is where Ding Darling used to stay. We're sitting in the Ding Darling Cottage. This is where Ding Darling stayed before he built his stilt house. He was a guest here year in and year out, and then for him to do his creative work where he did his sketching and his drawings, he would use the Ding Darling studio, which is adjacent to this cottage. One of the things that's interesting about our land up here is that these cottages have been here so long. I think they enjoyed not just the cottage and the property, but all of the guests that come here. In other words, every year, and we see it today, the same type of thing, that certain times of year, certain guests show up. And those guests create their own kind of community within the inn. This was his studio here, and what made this different, mostly like different from the cottages, were that the windows here that you see over here were all up high. They were shorter windows, but they were all up high, so he could be working, you know, sketching, doing whatever he wanted, and not be distracted by looking outside. Well, I think that the resort kind of highlights Ding Darling. I mean, it really does. I give a lot of credit to Dottie and John Wakefield, because they, at the time, they brought over some other cottages and sort of kept things going the way it was.
Well, there were certain cottages that people had every year. For instance, the Darlings, Penny and Jay Darling, had their one cottage. It was ours, it was Mother's, but it was just reserved for the Darlings every winter. And then he built his studio right next to it. He built that when Daddy was still alive because they agreed it was the Darling studio. No one else stayed in it.
So I think we can count our blessings that we have this here. In our company, we look to be stewards of this great property. And I was always concerned back then, you know, I went from this small little inn operator to all of a sudden, oh, we're bigger, and you know, are we going to lose some of the charm and some of the existence that was there? But I think because we've kept the cottages, and that it sort of kept that same spirit here at the inn, and I think it's been very vital to the culture. This here is the plaque that we put in 2 years ago, and I know Dottie was excited to see that we had made the National Historic Register. Dottie is a treasure. I mean, when I came here, not knowing a lot or any people on Captiva, because it was very close-knit at that point in time, she was so supportive of us.
Every day, Mr. Darling drew a cartoon and sent it in to Daddy. Jay Darling had come down there in a trailer called the Bouncing Betsy, and I guess it was Christmas. Then he took the trailer up and down Captiva and invited everybody in the trailer for a drink. But his first stop was for Daddy.
Captiva does something to people. And you talk about his influence, you know, it's obviously when Rauschenberg got here, and he acquired land basically so it wouldn't be developed.
What he did, in fact, accomplish on the islands, in Des Moines, in Washington, nationally, the wildlife refuge system. I don't think many people knows that island store there is Darling's idea. He purchased the land and had the store built. There's no grocery store at all down on Captiva. One of the reasons he wanted to have the store there was so they could get gasoline. And he tried to crack that gasoline problem, and he couldn't get it done.
Nowhere was his personal application of scientific observation more apparent than in the case of the red tide. His first experience with it was in December 1946.
We had what was called red tide. It isn't red and it isn't a tide. Thousands of fish are washing up on our beach in front of the cottage. The stench along the beach is something awful. And they're organizing crews now to bury the dead fish.
Frustrated, irritated, he just really could not understand because he didn't think it'd be that hard to solve. Now it turns out it's really hard to solve.
And of course burying those big fish full of gas generated by fermentation are about as easy to bury as a balloon. They won't stay down. Seems to be a microscopic bug which some people call a gymnodinium, which I can see under my microscope.
They didn't have scanners and fax machines in those days. The height of technology for communications was the Western Union station at the Old Bailey store. That was it, period. There may have been a telephone there eventually, but in those early days there weren't. How he would get that image to Des Moines or New York, that's a mystery I haven't solved. I can tell you how he got his first news of the day, by air. Buddy Bops used to fly over every morning, and they'd be wrapped up so many for tween waters. And Buddy was really good pilot and a really good bombardier. You know, these newspapers, you didn't want to get hit by that bundle. Darling succeeded in getting Sanibel and Captiva Islands both restricted by state law, no shooting. He came out with this sign, designed it himself, not only designed it and drew it, he made a bunch of them, and he goes around and he nails them up himself. That's a mark of something you do when you really care.
J. Darling suffered what was to be his final stroke early in February and died several days after he was hospitalized, 1962.
So when Darling died, a group called the Ding Darling Foundation was formed in Des Moines, and there was a counterpart to that was formed on the islands, and they worked together to get the refuge under ownership by the federal government, not as a leasehold. Well, the people there on Sanibel said, there's a lot more work to be done here. We may have the refuge done, but we had lots more work to be done.
In 1967, island members of the foundation split off to incorporate the nonprofit Sanibel Captiva Conservation Foundation.
And of course the people on Sanibel and Captiva were absolutely correct. They've never run out of things to do, and they have done incredible work. There are none of them that have made as much contributions, pound for pound, is that SCCF.
I got so carried away physically, painting with my hand, I didn't even want the brush to come between me and the image.
Robert Rauschenberg was born Milton Ernest Rauschenberg in Port Arthur, Texas, on October 22, 1925. After public school, he enrolled in the University of Texas at Austin. He studied pharmacology and served in the U.S. Navy in World War II in 1944. And 3 years later attended the Kansas City Art Institute. Along the way, he changed his name to Robert. He later took his studies to Black Mountain College in North Carolina, where he studied under Master Joseph Albers and alongside contemporary artists such as choreographer Merce Cunningham and musician John Cage. While at Black Mountain, Rauschenberg met artist Susan Weil and married her in 1950. Their son, Christopher, was born in 1951. With his move in 1970 from New York to Captiva, Rauschenberg cleared his palette, where he built up the graphic workshop Untitled Press Incorporated.
Captiva was peaceful. Captiva was quiet and remote. And so Captiva was still a secret.
He started off with the original beach house. When it got to be sort of close to dinner time, he would sort of look around the room, do a kind of a head count, and wade out into the water and fish until he caught enough fish for dinner. It's like, okay, I'm going to need 7 fish, okay.
Bob was just a new arrival on the island at that time. We just kind of got a soul connection. And the fact that he was letting me come and just drift through the studio before it became a studio, you know, it was just a house. And he had set up a 4x8, you know, door to work on a couple of sawhorses, the way we all did. I remember very well his first show.
I thought everybody could draw and paint. I found no difficulty in doing a likeness to anything. And it wasn't until after the Navy that I heard enough people saying, you ought to be an artist.
He didn't know that there was a job called artist. I got to get that job. I want to be the painting maker. Where do I apply?
You know, he was in New York, top of the food chain artist. His work was off the charts. Cy Twombly had come, and Bryce Martin was there, and Jasper John. It's like the movers and the shakers of the art world came to this remote island where Bob was. There was a lot of things about the archival materials that needed attention, and when I told Bob that, oh, you know, we could have a problem with this, we could have a problem with that, and he said, well, now it's your job to make sure we don't have a problem with anything. And so I was in charge of the researching and development. This is Bob working on a big metal painting with heat lamps. Acrylic paint, which was known to dry fast, wouldn't dry fast enough. And we would see smoke coming from the paintings.
My father put this property up for sale. Several people wanted to buy it, but my father had cottoned on to Rauschenberg, and he liked the idea of this big artist taking over this property. Bob could see that there was going to be a progression of takeover, probably all the way to Tween Waters.
This is my sister Nancy, but her real name is Cornelia.
Dad was a real conservationist, and as you know, he bought this property from Ding Darling. And I think Ding Darling was really thrilled when Dad came along, because he knew that he could trust Dad to preserve it the way it had been. And so when he and his wife, we called her Gigi, she was our stepmother. Dad was equally thrilled when Bob Rauschenberg said that he would agree to a conservation clause in the deed. I remember how thrilled Dad was. But as he was living here, Rusty, he could hear the sounds of bulldozers and nail guns and steam shovels, as we used to call them, north of here as this huge development was taking over the island. And he did not want to see Captiva further destroyed, ruined by this development. So he wanted to put up a barrier. And he decided that his property was going to be the barrier, that nobody, by God, was going to ruin this place.
Half the price was in cash, and the other half was Rauschenberg's portraits of the Van Vleck family. And the first thing he did when he got to it, this house, was to tear out a couple of walls and paint the walls and the ceiling white.
As the various neighbors got to a point where they needed to sell their properties, that's why they approached Bob, is because they knew he wouldn't develop it. And so that's why they gave him the first opportunity. And sometimes he had to dig pretty deep in his pockets to purchase them. He really had no cash. He was living off of a line of credit at South Florida Bank. And the hole got pretty deep before things turned around and started to get better. But I didn't see him worry about it once.
I appreciated that Dad appreciated Rauschenberg. He loved you, and he felt that if you appreciated Bob Rauschenberg, by golly,
that was worth it.
He would too. So if this is my first time here in 40 years, I'm impressed. I think he kept his word to Dad.
He could see that there was a real danger of the South Seas plantation just sort of expanding up the island. He went to the property owners in sort of a belt and said, I'd like to buy your property, but I don't actually need it for anything. I would like to buy it, I'll pay the bills, you live there, and when you're gone, then I'm not going to sell it to them.
In 1984, Rauschenberg announced his Rauschenberg Overseas Cultural Interchange, ROCKY. This would culminate in a 7-year, 10-country tour to encourage world peace and understanding.
He made these huge things to sell, to make money, to save the world. I'm sure this is what it was all about.
Well, it's interesting because you could describe that as generosity, in which case he was at the top of the scale of it. But it always seemed to me that it was much more that he was kind of a team player. If a point guard passes the ball to the center for them to dunk it, the point guard isn't being generous. The point guard is helping the team to do what the team needs to do for the team to win.
This was one of Bob's favorite flutes. It's a Native American medicine flute. It's made from the wood of an apple tree. One of the last times I saw Bob in the hospital, he asked me to play it for him. I met Bob Rauschenberg at a sushi and wine tasting party. He was there and got some chopsticks and started to play chopsticks on the different wine bottles, making like a percussion xylophone sound. And so then I came up and started blowing on the different bottles of wine, making flute sounds. And of course, when he played the piano, it wasn't just playing the keys, it was reaching in and playing the strings, and the poor piano kind of suffered. He would play anything you let him play. He might do something that would be the polar opposite, or sometimes he would answer in a sweet, beautiful way too. I would let him play some of my flutes sometimes, and he had a keyboard that he would play too, a synthesizer. Bob loved to play music. I use the word music in a loose sense of the word because he wasn't a trained musician at all. When I would travel with him, it was something like traveling with a rock star, only even better. I played for his opening at Ferrara, Italy, Bilbao, Guggenheim. I played at the National Gallery in Washington, D.C., the Metropolitan Museum of Art. I would usually play a solo flute.
Obviously, there's a practicality in having your art supplies be stuff that you find on the street. If you can't afford the stuff at the art store, which he couldn't, he had this rule that he could go around the block once, and that was the materials for his painting. But if he needed it, he could go around. He was allowed to go around the second block. That was sort of his, okay, well, I really didn't get enough for a painting here. But I think the idea was to sort of say, everything is interesting. If he had a chair in one of his paintings, he wouldn't go to the store and buy a brand new chair. It would be a chair that had been sat on. It would be a chair that had a life. So that he's not just putting a chair into the piece, he's putting all the butts that sat in that chair into the piece.
Bob had walked around New York. He found these two steps, and he found these chairs. He wanted it done like it was jewelry, but it weighed 1,500 pounds of bronze.
Whatever media he had chosen, whether paint on canvas, metal, plexiglass, cardboard, or fabric, he had always been a forerunner in almost every aspect of contemporary art.
Here we go.
My father was dyslexic, and one of the things that happens with dyslexia is that you invent your own way. If there's a normal path that everybody else takes, if you're dyslexic, that path doesn't work for you. You can't navigate that path. If you've got 50 people doing everything the same way, and one guy over here doing it a new way, this guy is inventing something.
My greatest joy is in working. That's when I feel a wholeness. I don't have anything on my mind when I go to work. A lack of purpose, probably.
Being so driven by curiosity meshes really well with you're going to invent everything yourself. All these things around you are more interesting than you think they are. They have all kinds of interesting conversations that they can have with each other if you bring them together into one place, and that one of the things that's being brought together to enter into the conversation is you, the viewer. Here's half of a conversation, and when you walk up to the painting, now there's a full conversation. I think with all his works, they all have as many different meanings as there are people to look at them, at least.
So it's a history of life on the planet through what was on the planet. The things that were neglected, the orphans, all the pieces in the park.
I used to play this one at the fish house quite a lot. I always saw his art as music, so I understood his art immediately because it just looked like music, the way it was composed. The colors are different notes, so it wasn't always beautiful, but music isn't always beautiful. Sometimes it's angry.
There's probably at least 4 or 5 of us that Bob bought cameras for. And the one instruction he gave us at one point in time was, well, don't take a picture of anything that's too interesting.
He was making this work, and everybody was getting all uptight about, now, is this painting or sculpture? We don't know if it's painting or sculpture. Is this painting or sculpture? It was like, come on, how stupid can you people be? Who cares if it's painting or sculpture? But they were really uptight about it. So he remembered that Calder had made up this word mobile, and then people did stop worrying about it. So he said, okay, I'm going to make up a word. I'm going to call it a combine. And then they could go, oh, it's a combine, and just look at it. You know? Stop worrying about if it's a painting or a sculpture. What your category is stupid. You know, go have an experience. Now, what category are you?
I could just do another Rauschenberg, but that would disappoint me. I wouldn't come over here if I knew what I was doing. I mean, somebody else could do it. Every day is a surprise, not always a good one. I don't think I'd be an artist if it was something that like a real profession. Let's do another pass.
He was an artist that worked. He would get stronger from making art. And all the mistakes that he made, you know, his mistakes was his happiest things. He said, if you knew how things would be, why do it?
Curiosity is only positive. And that's the reason that he could switch from making paintings to doing dance. He didn't mind it when the paintings became valuable and they were worth a lot of money. That wasn't a problem for him. He liked it, but it was never his reason that he did things. He started with nothing, and he had nothing for a long time.
I've always worked from the streets, and from either the images from the streets or the materials from the streets. I kept coming up with the idea of, it has to be something that appears to be disposable.
I never saw him say, oh, this painting just isn't working, I'm going to throw it away and start over. I never saw him do that. It was whatever he started to do, if it fought back, that was great. Something that would resist him, that would fight back, that would sort of say, well, you want me to be interesting, but I don't want to be interesting. That sense that Bob loved so much, you know, of like, now I have no idea what I'm doing. Now that I'm doing this, I have no idea what I'm doing. Oh boy.
Well, if you can say, oh, that's abstract expressionism, that's postmodernism, then you don't even have to look back, because you have the false illusion of knowing what you're looking at. And if you think that you know what you're looking at while you're looking at it, well, then it doesn't even have to be there.
And his attitude was, how come everybody's not here 24 hours a day, 7 days a week? Because why would you want to be doing anything else?
Bob used to say we shouldn't talk about the magic. We had to keep it in-house. And I could see why Bob didn't want us to talk. He tells the story of when he first came to Captiva, and he was driving near his property, and a ball of butterflies flew into the car. And he always wanted to look for symbols and signs. I think Captiva kind of chose Bob, and Bob just felt that this was the right place. What he was doing was natural. He was a shaman. He had that spirit of being in touch with nature.
I love the piece. I've gone through several phases myself. I had my own garden. I lived off the island. I used to love swimming. I still do. So I used to foolishly bake myself in the sun. I just felt healthy.
When he knew that he was dying and he was talking about it, he would say, you know, I'm not afraid of dying. I'm just worried I'm going to miss stuff. I don't want to miss anything.
To help Bob make his dreams, what a dream of a job is that.
I started paying attention to the tides. to the wind, to all the bird sounds and the fish jumping, and all that occupied my day and interested me. In fact, I felt a little too busy.
His idea was that the property in Florida, after he was gone, that it should be made into an artist residency. The idea is that you go and you have a powerful experience that you would not be the same person when you left. There's a sort of a spiritual aspect of it, that it makes you feel at peace in a certain kind of a way, that place.
I knew that I couldn't live without painting or making art. It was essential to my particular sanity.
For my father, the art world was, in a sense, a party that was at his house. So our job in the foundation is to keep the party going, to keep bringing out more trays of food.
Robert Rauschenberg lived and worked on Captiva Island from 1970 until his death on May 12, 2008.
You're not gone until the last person who remembers you is gone, you know? And that's going to be a long time for Bob.
One of the properties Rauschenberg acquired was that of fellow artist Maybelle Stamper, affording her the unique lifestyle she was accustomed. Born in 1907, Maybelle Richardson Stamper was committed to becoming an artist by her teen years. She studied initially in her hometown of Dublin, New Hampshire. By the early 1940s, Stamper had achieved considerable success as an artist and teacher. She exhibited at several New York galleries. In 1947, Stamper moved to then little-known Captiva Island. She gave up her academics to pursue the personal and artistic journey that would occupy the rest of her life.
Her little house, which had been given to her by a friend, and that was right opposite our driveway. That's how it was so easy for me to walk over to her house barefoot.
After first arriving on Captiva, Maybelle collected and sold seashells and eventually sold her songs to supplement her monetary needs. Around 1990, Robert Rauschenberg purchased Maybelle's property, assuming tax responsibilities and covering her monthly expenses.
Bob didn't actually purchase her property. What they did is they worked out an agreement essentially similar to a reverse mortgage.
Well, I knew who Maybelle was. She was a little strange, I'll admit. You'd see her on the road and she'd just dodge into the bushes. Larry Weeks came to me one day and said, Maybelle Stamper would like to paint your picture. Would you agree? I said, well, yeah, I guess so. So this went on for several weeks. There had to be negotiations. I never talked to Maybelle about it. Larry would come to me and say, would such and such a time be all right with you? Yeah. She'd go back and tell Maybelle, This went on for quite a while. So one day, the appointed day came. I sat every winter for 2 years. She said she was painting it in the way of the old masters. It's probably dusty. I had a mouth then. I've lost my mouth. I have no lips. I guess it's when I had hair. She finished it in 52. Yes, she did a good job.
In Florida, she continued to work, usually in watercolor and lithography, pulling her own prints on the press that dominated her small beach house. Those prints and paintings are filled with introspective images with diary-like inscriptions. She called them her songs.
I would describe her artwork as very detailed. I mean, for a painting to take 10 years, there's a lot of pondering that goes on in those 10 years.
She started laughing and I said, what's funny, Maybelle? She said, you're wonderful. You just sit like a shell. And I think while you're away, I'll paint a shell. So she did a Genonia. More people are knowing about Maybelle.
Maybelle continued working on Captiva Island, becoming more reclusive as the island became more developed.
Once Maybelle got to a certain age and really needed assistance, Bob always had somebody from staff helping her out, so I got the opportunity to take care of Maybelle. But then outside of that, she would give me a shopping list once a week, and I would do her shopping and bring her groceries. She and I would smoke a couple of cigarettes and have a beer together. The Schlitz beer, carrots, oranges, greens, mustard, turnip or kale greens. Mabel was very serious into organics. I think the cats ate a lot more than she did. Oh, and she sprouted her own seeds.
She ate nothing but weeds. Finally, after 4 or 5 dinners, Mabel said to me one day, "Sarita, I just don't eat meat. I'm not going to come to any more dinner parties."
She could literally go out into the woods and gather enough greens for an entire meal. I mean, she could live off of Captiva Island. She was a vegetarian, and I was buying top round and turkey legs so that she could feed the feral cats that lived in the woods. She wasn't eating the steaks. The cats were eating the steaks.
Her close friend Marie Coleman referred to Mabel as saying, "She would have, in my opinion, been the worst mother in the world. She made wild cats out of perfectly good domestic ones."
When she passed away, she said for me to make sure that I went in and got her purse. And I've still got a lot of, a little coin purse that she had that was in there. Oh, and one part, the start of one of her pendulums. She made lots and lots of pendulums. And then on the top, I think she developed her own language that she wrote in. Well, Mabel had written on the walls in a number of places. And so this is where she had written "Songs Out of the Sea," which Mabel called her artwork, her songs.
Living a frugal and hermit-like existence on Captiva, Stamper continued working through the 70s and 80s, but sold her work only when she needed to buy life's necessities. Her focus was her songs.
This is the catalog from the show that Jay Williams put together after Mabel passed away, when Marie had all the artwork. So the first venue of the show was at the McKissick Museum in University of South Carolina.
How or why Mabel moved to Captiva remains a mystery, but it was here that she reclaimed her freedom, her happiness, and her inspiration.
She was a searcher for a retreat. That's what she found on Captiva.
After more than 50 years living on Captiva Island, Mabel Stamper died in April 1995, leaving a legacy of hundreds of not only powerful, but thought-provoking images. Mabel Stamper was ultimately an original, for the rhythm of the surf and the sound of the wind still echo the songs of Mabel Stamper. Writer and aviator Anne Spencer Morrow was born on June 22, 1906.
I began these pages for myself in order to think out my own individual balance of life. And since I think best with a pencil in my hand, I started naturally to write.
Okay, girls, I sure hope you laid some eggs. Well, what do you know? Okay, it's good. It's not bad. Thank you, ladies. Thank you very much. We got a few. That little house, I think she probably wrote and reshaped her gift from the sea in there. She would go out and write in diaries because that was where she knew she could be alone and we wouldn't bother her. She hadn't used it for years before she died. It seems to me we've got a wasp nest somewhere in there. Yes, we do. And I'm just going to pretend it isn't there. That's the desk. She did use it and did love it. She just sat with her little pad and used it. This is the one. There we go. When she got too old, too fragile really, to travel to Europe, we had the house built here on the property and she died here in this house. This was my mother's room when she lived here. And this was one of the desks, one of her desks.
Captiva, Friday, March 5th, 1948. Who knows what these great rollers may turn up on the white sand of the conscious mind, a rose murex, or a lion's paw. But it must not be sought for, or heaven forbid, dug for. No, One should lie bare, open, flat as an empty white beach, waiting for a gift from the sea.
Anne Morrow met Charles Lindbergh in December of 1927 when she was a 21-year-old college senior.
His plane tested and flown from San Diego to New York without mishap. Charles Lindbergh watched it being towed, dripping wet in the early morning rain. The oversized tanks in wings, nose, and fuselage were filled with fuel. Final interviews were held, last-minute pictures snapped. Twice its wheels left the ground, only to return. And then the plane was airborne. On May 20th, 1927, 3,600 miles to Paris. Safely on the ground, he had barely cut the engine when the crowd reached the plane. They shouted his name over and over again, Lindbergh, Lindbergh.
My mother and father met in Mexico the Christmas after my father's flight to Paris in 1927. And he was in Mexico for Christmas, invited by my mother's father, the ambassador to Mexico. So my father came at his invitation with his mother, came to Mexico and met my mother and ready, God help us, for him. He liked, I think, her spunk.
The couple soon fell in love and married 2 years later. Anne soon became her husband's co-pilot and radio operator. The couple's flights across oceans and around the world fascinated the American public.
Into the cockpit of his Lockheed Sirius climbs Colonel Charles Lindbergh. Mrs. Lindbergh is with him. Flying together, as always, they are heading from Washington, D.C., across the Bering Sea to Japan. A perfect landing after almost half the world has rolled by beneath their wings. Cheers and waving flags as Tokyo greets them.
In 1930, she became the first American woman to get a glider's pilot's license.
Captiva, March 13th, 1950. Dear Land, today our rented bicycles came on the mail boat. We found them leaning against a banyan tree by the post office.
Anne Morrow Lindbergh scored an immense literary success with her 1955 book, Gift from the Sea. It was on the nonfiction bestseller list of the New York Times for 80 weeks and was #1 for 47 of those weeks.
It is a curious island, not a bit like the rest of Florida. I feel it has a spell on it. It is curiously, almost humorously, possibly even dangerously uninhibiting. One sinks into natural rhythms. One is even forced into them willy-nilly. The pounding of the sea. One cannot resist giving into it.
They got to know Captiva through the Newtons, Jim and Ellie Newton, and I think Captiva was the place that she had asked Jim to find her, where she could go and write. And he did, and that was the little house where she wrote the book. That was just for her, although my father did come. He not only came, but he brought several of the children to see her on Captiva.
Captiva Island, 1951. The other day I stepped backwards on a rickety pier through a hole in the planks. I escaped with only a skinned leg. Con and I will now pedal up to the post office and collect groceries. We look like a French bicycle race in our shorts and shirts and jockey caps.
When you read her diaries, you realize that this quiet time that she had was quite frequently broken into by family and friends. The retreat quality of that time was intermittent, but the quality of that time was extremely important for her writing.
I lay under the stars alone. I made my breakfast alone. Alone, I watched the gulls at the end of the pier dip and wheel from the broken bread I threw them. And it seemed to me that I was nearer to others in their aloneness. The sandpiper running in little unfrightened steps down the shining beach rim, the old gull hunched up, grouchy, surveying the sea. I walked way down the beach, drugged by the rhythm of the waves, until I felt really quite drunk with it. I went into the waves with nothing on, and then came home, drenched, drugged, full to the brim with my day alone, curiously whole for my aloneness. It has brought me to realize that the cure for loneliness is solitude.
Cure for loneliness is solitude. I think it's hers, and that's very, very much like my mother. Of course, I disagreed heartily. I thought the cure for loneliness is love. What is the matter? We don't take those silent times enough. They're very important. Silence is really, really important. Of course, I never shut up, do I?
Like love, it has been beautiful. Now I feel well. Early morning swims, nights under a cupful of stars. By the end of March, there will be scarcely anyone except the islanders who are so very nice. I feel like the full moon before the night has taken a single nibble of it.
Captiva meant privacy and freedom and a kind of refreshment to my mother. It meant something all her own.
It could, I suppose, be sinister and dangerous to live so sensuously, but one feels in Captiva a kind of purity about it. One sinks into childhood, clean as a piece of driftwood and left on the beach. One becomes bare, empty, open as a shell.
That is what the experience was. It was a washing, cleansing, refreshing, and there was always flow to it and movement and the tides. And of course she refers to all that in her book. And you feel it as you read. You feel rhythm, the rhythm of that book. The oyster shell is the family. Well, I think contemplation when I look at the moon shell. I think the shells were very important to her. This would be the marriage, yeah. So this is a beauty, yeah. This I think is my favorite. I like the mystery.
The shell is certainly the symbol for Captiva, filled with salt and sand and sun and the rhythm of the sea. But is there not a terrible lack of responsibility in living in the present? But for short periods, it is permitted, even vital.
Gift from the Sea has got this power to it. I do think it's timeless. But why this particular book when she wrote so many? And she had some wonderful things to say.
The only form of materialism here, the wealth, so to speak, is counted in seashells, and one becomes, almost against one's will, a child.
She herself was as a woman who could speak for other women. A lot of women say that she's talking to me, and she did.
Captiva, March 13th, 1950. Dear John, Evie Ames and I have just chased an enormous spider out of the house, big and furry, about the circumference of a grapefruit. Also, the woman next door found 4 palmetto rats in 4 bureau drawers.
It's a very musical book, as well as very wise and spiritual and very practical and simple. And it all goes together in this one very small package.
With Gift from the Sea, Anne became a hero to millions of readers for her thoughtful and lyrical meditation on the lives of women in the 20th century.
I did an introduction, but I would have liked it even without my introduction.
Seriously?
I promise.
Anne Morrow Lindbergh died on February 7th, 2001, in her home in Vermont at the age of 94. Living on Captiva is to experience an accident of temporary confinement in which only a few fortunate souls are ever selected.